A name was spoken on The Tonight Show, and Gene Hackman fell silent. It was February 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studios 6A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. The audience was buzzing with excitement because sitting in the guest chair was a legend who rarely appeared on television anymore. Gene Hackman, 91 years old, Hollywood icon, two-time Academy Award winner, and a man who had walked away from acting 20 years earlier to live a quiet life away from the cameras. Jimmy was mid-interview, all smiles and energy, thrilled to have Gene on the show. They'd been talking about the old days, stories from movie sets, funny anecdotes about co-stars, the kind of comfortable conversation that made great television. Gene was relaxed, leaning back in the colorful guest chair, a slight smile on his weathered face as he recounted a story about filming The French Connection in 1971. So there I was, Gene was saying, his voice gravelly but strong. Chasing that elevated train through Brooklyn, and the director yells, "Just drive faster, Gene," and I'm thinking, I'm already going 40 miles an hour on city streets. Jimmy laughed, loving the story. That's incredible. And you did your own stunts, right? No stunt double? Most of them, yeah. Young and stupid. Gene chuckled. Though I had a stunt coordinator who kept me from killing myself. Great guy. Taught me everything about. Oh. Jimmy interrupted, suddenly animated, snapping his fingers as a memory hit him. Speaking of stunt coordinators, I was reading your biography last week, amazing book, by the way, and there was this whole section about your early days in New York theater. Before you were famous. And there was this acting coach you mentioned who completely changed how you approached characters. What was his name? It was, oh man, it's right on the tip of my tongue. Jimmy shuffled through his blue interview cards, scanning for the name. Here it is. Victor Mancini. Your first acting teacher in New York, 1956. The biography said he was the most important mentor you ever had. Gene Hackman stopped breathing. A name was spoken on The Tonight Show that night, and Gene Hackman, one of Hollywood's most powerful actors, fell completely silent. He hadn't heard that name in 50 years. His hands, which had been gesturing casually during his story, suddenly gripped the armrests of the guest chair. His fingers pressed white against the fabric. The relaxed smile vanished from his face. His eyes, those famous eyes that had conveyed everything from rage to tenderness across hundreds of films, went wide and immediately began to glisten with tears. Jimmy noticed instantly. His own smile faded. Gene? You okay? Gene couldn't speak. His mouth opened slightly but no sound came out. He stared at Jimmy like the host had just reached across 50 years of time and pulled out something Gene thought he'd buried forever. The audience sensed a shift. The warm laughter from moments ago died into confused silence. 300 people suddenly uncertain what they were witnessing. The Roots stopped their soft background vamping. Questlove lowered his drumsticks, leaning forward from his kit. The cameras stayed locked on Gene's face, capturing every detail of his emotional collapse in high definition. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. Jimmy set down his interview cards slowly. Gene, I'm sorry, did I say something wrong? I just thought. No. Gene finally managed, his voice cracking. No, you didn't do anything wrong. It's just, I haven't heard that name in 50 years. Victor Mancini. I thought. He stopped, swallowing hard. I thought the world had forgotten him. Jimmy leaned forward, his host persona completely gone, replaced by genuine concern and curiosity. Who was he, Gene? Really? Gene looked down at his hands still gripping the chair. When he looked back up, there were tears on his cheeks. The legendary tough guy of cinema, the man who'd played cold-blooded killers and hardened detectives and men who never showed weakness, was crying on live television. He saved my life, Gene said simply. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1956. Gene Hackman wasn't always Gene Hackman, Academy Award winner and Hollywood royalty. In 1956, He was Eugene Alden Hackman, a 26-year-old kid from California with no money, no connections, and a dream that everybody told him was impossible. He'd just gotten out of the Marines. 4 years of service. He was directionless, working odd jobs, sleeping on friends' couches, bouncing between California and New York, trying to figure out what to do with his life. Someone suggested acting. Gene laughed at first. Him? Acting? He had a weird face. He'd been told that his whole life. Too severe. Too harsh. Not leading man material. But something about the idea wouldn't let go. So he saved enough money for a bus ticket to New York and arrived in Manhattan with $87 in his pocket and nowhere to stay. New York in 1956 was brutal. Gene found a tiny room in a boarding house on the Lower East Side, barely bigger than a closet, shared bathroom down the hall, rats in the walls. He worked 3 jobs: dishwasher at a diner, overnight stockboy at a warehouse, weekend janitor at an office building. And he tried to break into acting. He went to every audition he could find. Community theater. Off-Broadway showcases. Student films. Anything. He got rejected everywhere. Directors would take one look at him, this awkward ex-Marine with the harsh features, and dismiss him before he could finish his first line. You're not what we're looking for. Maybe try character work. Have you considered behind-the-scenes positions? After 6 months of constant rejection, Gene was ready to quit. He was 27 years old, broke, exhausted, and convinced that everyone who told him acting was impossible had been right. One freezing night in December 1956, Gene was walking through Greenwich Village after another failed audition, trying to decide if he should just give up and go back to California. He passed a small storefront with a handwritten sign in the window. Acting classes all levels, first session free. He almost kept walking. But something, maybe desperation, maybe fate, made him stop. He pushed open the door. The space was tiny. Folding chairs arranged in a circle. A small makeshift stage area. Maybe 8 other students already seated. And at the front of the room, a man in his 60s with silver hair, kind eyes, and a presence that immediately commanded attention. You here for the class? The man asked. Maybe, Gene said. The sign said first session is free? It is. I'm Victor Mancini. Grab a chair. Gene sat down. He didn't know it yet, but his life had just changed. Victor Mancini wasn't famous. He'd never been in movies. He'd spent his career doing regional theater. Small productions, teaching workshops, helping young actors find their voices. He charged almost nothing for his classes because he didn't care about money. He cared about the work. That first night, Victor had each student perform a monologue. When Gene's turn came, he stood up and delivered a speech from A Streetcar Named Desire, something he'd memorized weeks ago for an audition that hadn't gone anywhere. He was terrible. Stiff. Uncomfortable. Trying too hard. When he finished, the other students were politely silent. Gene sat down, face burning with embarrassment, ready for Victor to tell him he wasn't cut out for this. Instead, Victor smiled. Gene, can you stay after class? I want to talk to you. An hour later, after the other students had left, Victor and Gene sat alone in that tiny studio. You're trying to be someone you're not, Victor said. You're trying to be handsome. Charming. Leading man material. And it's killing your performance. I know I'm not. Gene started. Stop, Victor interrupted. Here's what you don't understand yet. Your face, your presence, the way you move, it's not a weakness. It's your strength. You're never going to be Cary Grant. Thank God. Because the world doesn't need another Cary Grant. The world needs someone who can show them truth. Someone who can play the people nobody else wants to play. The broken ones. The complicated ones. The ones who don't have easy answers. Gene stared at him, not quite understanding. You're going to be a character actor, Victor continued. And if you let yourself be that, If you stop fighting what you are and start using it, you're going to be one of the greatest this city has ever seen." For the first time in months, Gene felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. He became Victor's student. Not just in that class, but privately. Victor saw something in Gene that nobody else had seen, and he cultivated it with fierce dedication. They worked together 3 times a week. Victor taught Gene how to find truth in a character, how to use his unconventional looks as an asset, how to stop apologizing for taking up space. Victor never charged Gene for the private sessions. When Gene tried to pay, Victor would wave him off. "Pay me by becoming what I know you can become. That's all I ask." For 2 years, Gene studied with Victor. He started getting small roles. Tiny parts in off-Broadway shows. Nothing glamorous, but he was working. He was learning. He was becoming an actor. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. In 1958, Gene got his first real break, a supporting role in a production that would transfer to Broadway. It wasn't a lead, but it was legitimate theater. His career was starting. He went to Victor's studio to tell him the news. He found the door locked. A note taped to the window. "Classes suspended temporarily." Gene tracked down one of Victor's other students. That's when he learned Victor had cancer. Advanced. He'd known for months but hadn't told anyone. He was in the hospital. Gene went immediately. He found Victor in a ward at Bellevue Hospital, looking 20 years older than he had just weeks before, the cancer eating him alive. "Gene," Victor said, his voice weak but his eyes still sharp. "I heard about Broadway. I'm so proud." "Victor, why didn't you tell me you were sick?" "Because you had work to do. I wasn't going to distract you with my problems." Gene sat by that hospital bed and cried. This man, this teacher who had believed in him when nobody else would, who had seen potential where everyone else saw failure, was dying. "I'm going to quit the show," Gene said. "I'm going to stay here. Take care of you." "Absolutely not," Victor said firmly. "You're going to do that show. You're going to be brilliant. And you're going to remember something from me." "What?" 20 years from now, when you're successful, and you're going to meet some kid who looks wrong for this business. Who everybody is rejecting. And you're going to see what I saw in you. And you're going to help them. You're going to pass it forward. Promise me." Gene promised. Through tears, he promised. Victor Mancini died 3 weeks later. Gene was in rehearsals. He didn't find out until 2 days after the funeral. There was no obituary in the major papers. No memorial service. Victor had been just another struggling theater teacher, unknown and unremembered by the world. But Gene never forgot. He went on to have the career Victor predicted. Broadway. Hollywood. 2 Academy Awards. Dozens of iconic roles. He became exactly what Victor said he would become. One of the greatest character actors of his generation. And he kept his promise. Throughout his career, Gene quietly helped young actors who reminded him of himself. He'd show up at acting workshops unannounced. He'd give advice to struggling performers. He'd pay for someone's headshots or acting classes without them knowing where the money came from. But he never talked about Victor publicly. It was too personal. Too painful. The man who had saved his life had died anonymous and forgotten, and Gene carried that grief like a stone in his chest for 50 years. Until tonight. Until Jimmy Fallon, reading from a biography, casually mentioned a name Gene thought the world had forgotten. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Jimmy set his cards aside completely. "Gene, tell us about him. Tell us about Victor." And Gene did. For 12 uninterrupted minutes on live television, Gene Hackman told America about the teacher who saved him. About the tiny studio in Greenwich Village. About the man who saw potential where everyone else saw failure. About the promise made in a hospital room. When Gene finished, Jimmy stood up from his desk. He walked around to where Gene sat, pulled a blue interview card from his jacket pocket, and wrote something on it. "Gene, I want you to have this," Jimmy said, handing him the card. Gene looked down. On it, Jimmy had written, "Victor Mancini, teacher, changed everything, 1956. Don't let him be forgotten again," Jimmy said quietly. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Gene stood up. He hugged Jimmy. And then he turned to face the audience directly. "If Victor were here," Gene said, his voice steady now, "he'd tell me to stop crying and say something useful. So here it is. If you've ever had someone believe in you when nobody else did, say their name. Out loud. Right now. Don't let them disappear." The studio erupted. Standing ovation. People shouting names through tears. The Roots playing softly. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Jimmy had Victor Mancini's name added to a permanent plaque in Studio 6A listing. Teachers who changed lives. Gene Hackman carried that blue card in his wallet every day. And he never stopped saying the name.